in different forms. And so wanted to welcome you to respond to the reflection questions that are on the screen and just put a few keywords in the chat of things that resonate for you. And then the logistics here is we are live streaming the session on Facebook. So if you would rather your name and face not be shared, then just turn off your camera and change the name on your title. And if you need any logistical help, just let me know. And we're just going to give it a few more minutes because we've got a few more people joining. All right, welcome all, and thank you for joining us. We're just going to give it a few more minutes and give people a chance to respond to the reflection questions that are on the screen. As I mentioned before, we are live streaming so that if you would rather your name and face not be shared, then you can turn off your camera and change your name. Great. Welcome everybody coming in the room. We're excited to share the comments with you. We're going to give this a few more minutes to just give folks a chance to respond. And also just wanted to note that we are live streaming on Facebook. And so if you don't want your face to be on there or name to be on there, then you can just change your name and turn off your camera. We've got a few more folks coming into the room, so we'll give it a few more minutes.
As you're coming in and reflecting on these questions, put in the chat some keywords that are coming up for you for both prompts.
So Lainey says, for worsening political polarization, repeating an opinion of a major figure from their side or party without nuance, or really explaining what they themselves think. Cool. Should we go for it, Julie? Yeah, great, perfect. So we're really here. We started with these reflection questions because they really anchor a lot of the work that we're doing with the Commons and have been doing with the Commons. And so what we're here today is really talk about the Commons project. I think a handful of folks know about this, and some of you may be new to the Commons project. This is a project that we've been doing through Build Up in various forms for the last 4 years. Centered around the US, and has really been our effort at exploring what role social media can play within the goals of depolarization within the US, and specifically having thousands of conversations to actively and directly engage with our own social media networks. And so our aim today is really to share the context for how we see social media contributing to polarization, and given our experience with the Commons, what we think social media means for peace building, and what it means for each of us within our respective communities. And just to give a little bit of an agenda here, our aim is to give a presentation for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and more of a discussion-based conversation.
Okay, so we know that social media impacts polarization, and that's something that any average social media user also knows. Maybe they don't have the language for it, but it's something intuitive. And so we've been trying to tease out exactly in what ways, and therefore in what ways can we engage. Thinking specifically of the dynamics of polarization, which we'll get a little bit to later, we think social media adds to these dynamics in a few key ways. Two main ones, not listed here on the screen, but that could be an overarching one, is that social media has two key affordances that increase polarization. One is that profiling and algorithms drive engagement. So we're able to be targeted based on identity factors. And then those algorithms feed things based on those identity factors that drive more engagement. Two is that nudges foster compulsion and a dependency on engagement. So if I can explain this as in a flow, these targeted messaging and advertising tailors political and cultural messages, usually to increase the support or cohesion of a group or polarized group. And these algorithms reinforce worldviews by putting like-minded content and people at the forefront, and it preferences content that creates more engagement. The types of content that create more engagement are emotionally heightened content that generates either outrage or dedication. And the attention for profit model dictates that having more engagement, the opinion that's being built into those algorithms is that more engagement is better, and the type of content that gets that kind of engagement is often polarizing. And so this opens the door to many of these other dynamics that increase polarization, like the use of manufactured consensus or computational propaganda, which are here, the use of targeted messages, which I mentioned already in that list, birds of a feather, where algorithms are reinforcing point of views, and we're engaged in information ecosystems that confirm our biases and don't expose us to other views in positive ways. And then the access to speed and scale, of course, increases things as well.
And I think a lot of the conversation that we're seeing here in the US, especially with the rise of the social dilemma, is, do I use social media or do I completely abstain from social media? And we've been really appreciating this lens from Evan Greer, where it says, the social dilemma, alongside with a lot of tech observers, are making this conversation around treating social media as if it's cigarettes, something that's addictive and bad with no value at all. And she's comparing the internet to more like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I think many of us on this space would probably agree that our lives are better with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so we've really been asking, if social media is also making our lives better in some ways, but also more complicated in other ways, then what is it that we can do within social media to really respond to how it's infecting us as individuals, but also our society at large?
Right. Yeah, one key point of the commons is that, if we wanted no polarization or conflict to happen on social media, we'd probably tell people to just delete their accounts, but that's obviously not what we're doing. So when it comes to how we engage as peace builders at Build Up, we've been working on this framework around how we can engage in digital technologies, obviously, and we think it's important to dig deeper into the socio-technical ecology that we now exist in, because it's changing how conflicts unfold and how we engage with conflict, as we're seeing on social media. With an eye to social media, there are a number of levers that we can engage with. And we'd say that most of our attention to date have been focused on the top two areas of this pyramid. And when I say our attention to date, I'd say people who are responding to conflict on social media. Addressing the deliberate use of digital technologies to promote division, to attack social cohesion. And the second layer down is still deliberate, though a little more covert, ways of attacking these. Platforms can address these with rules of service, with content moderation, etc. Peace builders are trying to address these with digital literacy programs, etc. But when you think about it, these two parts of the pyramid are really important, but they're also quite limited, because the deliberate use for division are signals of deeper divisions that technology is worsening by amplifying human weaknesses. So we think it's important, obviously, to address hate speech, disinformation, recruitment, etc. But we also think we need to go deeper and to address the issues that are underlying those and the issues that are central to social cohesion, which is not news to anyone here who comes from a peace building lens. And so that's what we think is at the bottom of this pyramid. We've been spending a lot of time in the third level of this pyramid, and this is where it worries us a little bit, because beneath the overuse of digital technologies to foster division is this broader systemic effect that digital technologies are having on human communications, on human neurology. We often say, they're affecting our identity formation, it's affecting our discourse, it's affecting how we interact with one another and creating these conditions of affective polarization, etc. So the Commons as a project, I'd say, is pretty squarely placed in this third rung of the pyramid, trying to get at that deeper level, which is around identity construction and affective polarization.
Yeah, and just building up what Julie was talking about, what we've been doing with the Commons really since 2016 is directly engaging on social media platforms as humans and as full humans. And so this looks like a lot of us just having a lot of conversations, both within our known social media networks, but also within folks that may or may not be known to us. And our aim really through that direct engagement has been to foster more plural, complex conversations. And through doing so, I think what we've found is that has impacted our own sort of consciousness around human communication, and also around how we are engaging on social media and how we're sort of holding the values of peace building on social media. And we can talk about this a little bit more in more depth as we sort of go, but I think that, one of the questions that might be here is like, why are we exploring digital peace building using social media, and why now? I think for those of us that are in US context, we know really clearly that social media has heavily affected our relationships, and also just the information and sort of the knowledge, and even the sort of undermining of truth and undermining of institutions within the United States, and has been sort of a critical role for coordinating violence. And so you might be asking, like, why are we exploring digital peace building using social media, and why now? And some of the reasons that we think social media can be used for peace building, is really critical for peace building, and has been at sort of the core of the Commons, is that where social media affordances can clearly be used in ways that complicate our conflict, or exacerbate our conflicts, or accelerate conflicts, we also think that social media can be used as a medium for peace building. And so we think that, like, the speed and scale has been something that we've been testing through the Commons. So Commons 1.0, we were really trying out automation, and really using automation through bots to see if that's a way that we can reach more people faster. And we were really trying now, sort of through like Commons 3.0, is really sort of saying, what does speed and scale look like through our own networks of trust? So really starting to say, what does like a distributed network of peace builders on social media look like? I think a second piece of it that's really critical, and we're seeing this both in sort of ways that are complicating the conflicts within the United States, but I think also can be used for peace building, is one of the things that we've been testing out within social media, is how can we specifically target or engage specific groups of people using the functions of social media. And I think we all know this, but just to name this, we can think about this as one-to-one through things like direct messaging, one-to-many, or sort of many-to-many. I think what's also really critical here is this can look like sort of individual messaging, or can look like more here's the peace building messages that I'm talking about, and sort of more something that's around sort of exposure and less direct engagement from there. We also think that within the peace building space, we talk a lot about sort of top down versus sort of bottom up peace building. And we think that social media has a way to support so many of our voices to be heard, and thus can be a space for shared and distributed peace building that makes sense within each one of our networks and within the relationships that we have. And so one of our goals for this webinar is really to sort of say, what does this look like for each of us to engage with this, especially given our collective interest in peace building? And how can it also allow us to engage as individuals in the same ways that we might be engaging with other venues or areas of our life?
So when it comes to specifically what we do or what are the strategies that we're using on social media, and this is, come through all of the different versions of the Commons that we've tried out over the years, and our current version is to really see what it looks like to respond directly to what are the dynamics of polarization and what are the strategies for messaging around depolarization. So when it comes to polarization, we know that it's a process and it's best defined by its dynamics. And these are the key 6 dynamics that happen during the process of polarization. Many of these dynamics we're seeing now. Stereotypes and vilifications of the other group, reduced lines of normal communication, etc. Because there's reduced lines of communication, because there's reduced trust, then people feel freer to engage in harsher tactics towards the other group, more violent rhetoric, etc. And so we're looking at what the responses to these are in terms of our own individual roles on social media and what roles we can play out. And so, just taking the top one, for example, we can share the slide afterwards as well for the whole list. But for example, stereotypes and vilifications of the other group. So response to that dynamic would be communications that humanizes the other, to foster complexity in conversations where stereotypes simplify them, to bridge networks and facilitate new relationships, to moderate destructive conversations when we see them on our own or on others' feeds, depending on what kind of platform that you're using. And so we see that there's strategies and roles for a social media behavior in response to each of these dynamics of polarization. And here's a couple of examples of people doing this. Here's one example which fills a role of moving beyond positions into more of an interests and needs space, which is familiar language to peace builders. But this is, someone saying, someone expressing, concern or whatever about Trump getting COVID, and the media's response to that. And the response to that, getting it into this space of interests and needs, the response is here on the right. So notice that it expresses empathy, it expresses intention for the conversation, and then it takes it into a deeper place of conversation, which is a peace building strategy that worked here online and is working in other conversations we're seeing. Here's another one about humanizing narratives. This is someone sharing a personal narrative. And we found that this personal narrative and vulnerability space is another one that has been really effective and continues to be effective for people who are doing the work with us at the Commons.
And this is one that we did right around the inauguration. So this was right after the violence at the Capitol. And it was really sort of saying, how can we mobilize within our networks to identify and take action? I think especially when within the Commons team, we were seeing just a lot of people stepping back and unclear on what messaging made sense right then. And really just unclear how to show up in a way that acknowledged the violence that had just happened within the Capitol, but also sort of asked to assert a different type of intention than to reinforce that violence. And so what we were trying to do within this is just try to create a guide to how people could show up around the inauguration and what was sort of the messaging that people could use within the inauguration, and really sort of thinking about detailing out some of the roles that people could use around the inauguration. And we saw a lot of people use this within their social media networks as a way to sort of assert a goal of both holding, depending upon who they were speaking to, but just sort of holding accountability, but also sort of still recognizing and sort of aiming for a different and better future that's centered a society that's holding peace as its core rather than holding violence as its core. And this last example, and I think a lot of folks have seen it, is just an example of promoting positive messaging. And so you can see Monica here did a lot of work with the Plus Peace team. They had done a lot of work just around Shine on the Vote, specifically around the election period. And you can see Monica's point here on just talking about people will never knowingly vote against their self-interest, and really sort of asking us to come together, to work together to change that dynamic and start to promote sort of a message around what we can do sort of collectively to center sort of equity, peace, and justice to folks, and really sort of holding that within her community.
So these are obviously just a couple of examples. We have literally thousands from over the years of examples. But we want to say, you may not have seen yourself in the examples that we shared, these, 4 examples, and it was just only a small piece of the roles that people can play. If you think of polarizing dynamics, that first side of the table that we shared, to depolarization strategies, that second side of the table, that really translates into what we're now thinking about roles that people can play, and there being these 4 categories of roles. And so this is our invite to you, is what need do you see in your social media neighborhood? What polarizing dynamics are you seeing? And then what strategies can you deploy, or what roles can you play in responding to those? And this is just, a graphic here you can see of some main categories and options within those. And we'll be putting this out as a longer resource as well. So you can see, what are some of the key tools and skills and behaviors within each role. But hopefully it's just an invite to you to start thinking about what fits for you, what needs you're seeing, and how you could engage.
And we just concluded with a few of the resources that we've been working on and are going to keep working on over the next year. One, we've got 2, if this is work that you're interested in, and I know a lot of you are already part of this, so welcome and thank you for being there. But we've got 2 Facebook groups. We're really exploring social media and depolarization around 2 lenses. One is kind of depolarizing of politics, and the other one is around anti-racism and liberation. And so within that, we've got sort of an online community and weekly calls that happen. The second thing that we just launched this week as our pilot is our self-guided course. This is within both of those Facebook groups. So there's 2 tracks that you can choose from, and we're really interested to hear your feedback and thoughts. And thank you to a handful of folks that are on this call that have already taken that and responded. We appreciate you. And the final thing that we're really trying to do with this iteration of the Commons is really start to build a digital peace building playbook. And we see this as both a space of sharing specific examples, but also starting to dig into what are some of the technical strategies when we go back to the social media affordances. What are the ways in which we can target specific groups of people or engage specific groups of people? What are the ways in which we can reach kind of speed and scale? And what are some of the ideas around what has worked better or has not worked better within this space? And so we'll keep building that from there. And I'll drop the link tree into the chat, just where we've got all of the details on that.
So we now have about 20 more minutes scheduled in this call for questions, discussion. I'm seeing that we also have some folks here who have been involved in Moscone, which is the Commons project essentially in Kenya. And so I'd love to hear reflections from you, and feel free to ask to us or any of them, and we can just have this be a discussion format. Oh, one note is that if you don't want to come on, as Kate mentioned at the beginning, we're streaming on live. If you don't want to come on live, but you do have a question, feel free to just put that in the chat and we can read it in.
So Julie Raymond says, how do you see social site owners responding to your efforts?
So this has changed based on different strategies. So in earlier versions of the Commons, when we were using more automation, then we were facing challenges just in because we were, being applied obviously to the same rules that everyone is applied to in terms of not spamming people, etc., even though we felt like we were doing it for a good purpose, etc. So we did have some challenges early on about getting API revoked and things like that. We are in conversation, and Kate, you can speak more to this, with people at Facebook in different kind of areas of the organization. And I'd say the response is generally positive, but we're also really small fish and they've got bigger fish to think about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think people are really interested in this and just really curious how it works. And so I think that there's been a space of curiosity, but not necessarily sort of integration into their platforms or anything different in those relationships.
Yeah.
Other questions that are coming up for folks? So Lena, you're asking, have you pitched this to Facebook as something they might want to recommend for Facebook moderators to learn about? We've talked with Facebook a number of times about this, and I think that they're deeply aware of the Commons and have seen sort of the previous reports in there. I haven't seen them take up anything around how that's translating into their Facebook moderator lens.
I'd say the focus still seems to be quite heavy on like the top two pieces of that pyramid, which is understandable. And I think there's just hope that a civil society takes on that third and lower role of the pyramid. Carol Frampton says, do you see a different response since January 6th? What have you observed?
Absolutely. I think, I mean, we've had a lot of conversations just within, I think like we're all seeing different responses on January 6th. I don't think we're not doing like a really intentional social media listening effort with this lens of the Commons. And so a lot of it is coming in sort of anecdotally through what we're hearing through just the Commons network and what we're sort of seeing in our own Facebook pages and Twitter pages and Instagram pages, etc. I think some of the stuff that I've personally seen is that a lot of people are stepping back because they're unclear how to have a conversation around what's happening in the US. I think on the other side, I think you're seeing a lot of people just like not have conversations about what happened on January 6th because they're not even sure about what is the language to use around what happened, since there's such a contention around even the terms that we're using to describe January 6th and the violence at the Capitol. And I think that like I'm also personally seeing and hearing from other people that we're seeing sort of more people sort of retreat back into their existing identity affiliations, mostly based around sort of politics within that space. And I think a lot of people are also just like withdrawing and just frustrated with that level of violence in the United States, and just feel like that's sort of an ongoing experience that they personally have had and are unclear on what that means for where we go forward, and sort of feel like it's a continuation of more of the same. I don't know what you're saying, Julie.
Yeah, it's interesting. One key change for key way that Commons has evolved and how it's working this year is that our efforts at achieving scale now, instead of using ads and automation as we were before, we're now trying to do these distributed networks of trust. And so I'd say that the answer to that question really depends on whose network you're talking about. This is something within the Commons team and within the larger community of advocates, we can often do to say, this is what my information ecosystem looks like. What does yours look like? And just, it's clear how different those are based on who people have in their network. And so therefore that determines the roles that people are playing in their own networks. So yeah, I'm certainly seeing differences in my own network that has more people in it that I would say are supportive of what happened on January 6th. And I'm seeing a lot of deplatforming happening. So I personally, in my effort and individual effort in the Commons, looking at like, what does it look like to follow people to MeWe, or to engage on the different networks. Another question, do you feel social network sheer size is a limiting factor to controlling polarization? That's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the size is overwhelming. I think the size is really overwhelming. I also think that one of the things that we've been holding within the Commons is that we all have the ability to shape the norms and behaviors within our society. And equally, I think this is backed up by a lot of the technology research of how norms and behaviors are being shaped on different platforms, is that there is something really critical about naming and really embodying the norms and behaviors that we want to shape. And so where I do think that social media is an overwhelming size, I also think that it can be a critical space for us to shape those societal norms. And one of the things that I think a lot about personally is that where social media in comparison with real-time conversation, social media, even if I think it like by structure encourages us to think fast or move fast, in reality, it can be more of a slow medium where it gives us time to really think about how we want to engage, and gives us time to really think through that and construct that in a way that I think real-time conversation doesn't necessarily do. And so I also some ways feel that it can be a good training space for all of us to be able to show up more fully and wholly also in real-time conversations too. I'll grab the next question for you.
Yeah.
So you highlighted that the actual causes of the problem are much deeper than the general focus on technology, and go deeper into the effects on human interactions. Did you explore or look into who's working on that? For example, by looking at education and how we prepare youth to use these tools.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more what you mean by who's working on that. I think, from the beginning of the Commons, we've said like we're working on one entry point, but we need people coming in to all of these other entry points of polarization. So certainly like people working on education, people working on the sort of digital literacy programs that with youth, etc. Like all of those are really important. Those who are working on policy, those who are working on social like advocacy against attention for profit model, like we think all of those entry points are really important, and people are coming in it from a lot of different angles. And this affect of polarization on social media is kind of our angle. And so there are, of course, others working in this space. And creating sort of networks and coalitions around this. Thought Partnerships is one, Overzero is another. So we're, certainly in conversation with them and trying to collaborate where possible.
And I can carry these next two questions. So Ray sort of says, do you think we need to train moderators how to moderate? And I think this really fits into, can we describe more fully what are the key dilemmas and how we're taking forward the commons in 2021 and 2022?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I can definitely take this. I think what we've been doing within the commons is sort of asking, what does it look like for people to feel activated and to hold sort of a peace building lens and sort of role on their social media networks. And I think we're still sort of asking this question is like, what is it? Well, I mean, I think one, I just named that. I think there's a lot of people that are active on social media in ways that really embody what we think depolarization is. And I think the second piece is that oftentimes, and what we found with Mascani and with the comments beforehand, is digital peace building and what it sort of looks like for the vast majority of us, like doesn't mean anything until we've done it. Because at that moment in time, we start to see what are the complexities there, what are sort of the feedback loops and sort of the responses that we're getting from other people within our networks. And so I think that we've really been asking, what does that activation look like for people? Like, what does the invitation look like for people where they are interested in sort of actively engaging online? I think one of the questions that we've been holding within the comments is like, can we all collectively hold 10,000 conversations over the next 6 months? And what would that mean to do as I say sort of a cohort, because I mean like all of us in sort of shared societies, whether that's digital or sort of physical. And so we've really been sort of asking, like, can we set sort of that large goal and then see what does that mean for sort of our own way of engaging online? And equally, what does that mean for the way in which social media sort of exists as sort of a network? I mean, even if we look at like the social media use within the United States, that's still a drop in a bucket, like 10,000 conversations. But it starts to sort of think about like the scale and sort of the exposure in different networks that starts to reach sort of a critical mass where we can start to say what has changed in that process. And clearly sort of, I think the question that goes along with sort of the training of facilitators or sort of moderators is like, how do we keep showing up to do that again and again? And what does that sort of experience of having done that over the next 6 months really mean for sort of our ongoing and sort of consistent work within the commons?
I can add to that, Kate, and just adding more to the taking the commons forward. I think the key challenge and also the key opportunity in the space we're moving the commons towards right now is one that we sometimes describe as movement building. And so along with that comes all of the challenges of building a movement, of getting the scale, getting over a tipping point of engagement, getting people that are actively engaged and involved in doing the work. But we think that's so critical for future action, for the future of the commons, because that movement building and those numbers of committed people it unlocks a space of social media, like strategic communications that wouldn't be there before. Like in this presentation, we showed a lot of individual examples and, we talked about individual roles that you can play, etc. But it becomes a next level thing when we can say within a committed group, I would like, we could have more influence and impact if I make a post and then 100 people share that post and then we're liking and engaging, because then it goes into those affordances of social media, which privileges material content that gets higher engagement. And so if we can use those affordances to increase our own influence and impact, that's something that's more possible when you have a committed group working together. So that's where we're trying to move now and when we see the future of the commons, it's around these like committed cohorts that can extend each other's influence because of collective action.
Absolutely. And if anybody wants to jump on screen to also ask questions, please,
Yeah.
You're welcome to. This definitely doesn't need to be our conversation.
Yeah. I wonder if we could have this success conversation, or Kate, we have here, like, can you give examples of really successful exchanges? And then also, how do you gauge the success of exchanges? Is it how long? Is it significant, etc.?
Yeah. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I was tossing it over to you. Yeah, so I'd say what is defined as successful depends on what the goal of the interaction is. And as we said, there's lots of different strategies for depolarization and roles people are playing. So I'd say a successful exchange, if you are, if your goal is to humanize the other or humanize yourself, if you're an othered in that process, then a goal is, sharing some vulnerability and having response to that vulnerability that's positive. And so that's not something that requires a long exchange. So that level of success could even be 1 or 2 messages in response. But if you are having, a longer term goal of, if your strategy is around bridging, you're trying to bridge different sides together, then that might be a more sustained engagement required. So is that you're hosting conversations over months, so multiple exchanges that are coming together, and then it's successful. And I think, we're doing more around like impact measurement, et cetera, now that we have a larger group and we're reporting on actions people are taking every month. I think a lot of it comes down to, do you felt like this moved the needle? Like, it's almost like a note and you see it kind of thing. So like, you as the engager, you as an intervener, do you feel like this moved the needle positively or negatively? And then kind of just taking people's intuition on that. Would you add, Kate?
Yeah, I think that feels right to me. And I think that the other piece that we have been holding is just the dialogue triangle, which you'll see within our social media sort of playbook, which sort of starts with kind of listening as a way to, and I think we see this in a variety of different lenses and different perspectives, but as a way to sort of hear and explore sort of curiosity, which I think sits within a lot of peace building strategies and sort of experience, but as a way to sort of de-escalate the like divisive sort of emotions or sort of those emotions that we're sort of running with. And then really sort of seeing like if there's a way to share perspectives and sort of our own perspective in that. And I think the third one is like really start to identify action, which not everybody gets to this space, but I think within the anti-racism side, I think if one of our goals really is to fundamentally sort of move resources and sort of reallocate resources, then there is a question around what that looks like with an action. I think within the depolarization side, it's sort of asking what are the opportunities for each of us to take action within our own communities, and what does that look like with sort of an interpersonal space. And so I think one of the things that we've also been asking is like, what are the conversations that move across that dialogue triangle? And what does that mean for who is sort of activated to engage their own social media networks in a different way than they might have before?
I would just add to this that I know that many of you have followed earlier versions of the Commons Project, and thanks for continuing on with us in our evolving. In a past iteration, we were able to be much more mathematical about defining success, and that we were able to do network maps and run models and show the needle moving by seeing how like co-occurring relationships across the divide. And that type of measurement isn't as possible this time. So we are looking at, just how that looks differently with individual reporting, et cetera. But we do want to be able to extrapolate that out to a community level scale, but it's just trickier this time.
Other questions for folks? Also, feel free to turn off your mic and jump on.
We asked if that's because of cost factors. Not necessarily. It's more platform limitations and people now engaging on different platforms. In the past iteration, we had a paid team of facilitators that were having a certain number of conversations with people we had pre-identified and then could then measure those same people that we had identified. This time, because we're using this like distributed network movement building approach, we don't have pre-identified members, and it's reliant on people's own individuals' networks of trust that they're engaging with, which are often in private spaces. So private messages, private groups, etc., that we can't measure in that same way. We don't have access to the data. So then it's like self-reporting by people who are engaging in those networks instead.
That was well said. I think we've also just been asking is like, what does it look like for when each of us are engaging our own individual networks? And there's a lot of trust that's built into that. And so what does it look like to share lessons learned and share sort of experiences in a way that aren't extractive, but are reflective and sort of respectful of those relationships? And so that's what we've been asking is like, how do we create sort of the space for learning together?
And it's asking, do you feel you're able to attract more conservative users in the Commons approach, or still not so much? Yes and no. I'd say it's still now dependent on the advocates networks. So I'd say within the advocates that are engaging, then yes, we are certainly reaching conservatives, and that is a focus of several of us that are engaging who have strong networks of trust in those places. It's different this time in the way, like I said last time, where we could say we've gathered this group of target users and we can score an ideology score and have half of the people who engage us be conservatives. That's not the case this time. So it's less measured, but it is happening because that is a focus of many of our individual advocates networks. Kate, would you write? Is that how you explain that?
That's exactly how I would explain it. And I would add to it is the other piece that Julie and I have been doing over the last few months is also pushing advertising out to different geographies, usually sort of in line with where people had voted for the 2020 US election. And so are using that to also reach a variety of different people based upon kind of the proxy measure of where you live as sort of a equivalency of who you voted for or what might be spreading across political lenses.
Yeah, so one example of the advertising and one new potential approach at scale is that we have some advertising now around where it's a advertising directed at certain geographies that invite people to select a send message button. So we need them to take a little action. This is going to require some refinement, but you click the button on the advertisement and then you have a Facebook bot that goes through a short little talk about depolarization and invites for further action. So that's just one example. Another ones were around January 6th or around the inauguration, and we pushed posts around using the nonviolent inauguration material and prompts. With the goal of that advertising not to be for them to send a message, but to have engagement so that they would comment on the advertisement on the posts and then get the human conversation. So it's a conversation starter.
Yeah, and I can share just two examples. So this is one example of one of the ads that we'd sent right after, right around the inauguration. Really what we were trying to do is say, when violence escalates in ways we largely can't control, listening and sharing with other people can be a way to meet this moment with attention and care. It's an action that can take impact and can reduce fear, anger, and anxiety. And with the inauguration around the corner, who is one person you can reach out to and listen to in order to foster hope for the future of our society? And so it's really sort of asking people to reach out within their networks. One of the other ones that we tried out is, and I think, let me see if I can get this full image, but was just like asking what can we do now to make 2025 less polarized and more peaceful, and really just sort of ask people to respond within that space. And I think like in general, like one of the challenges that always comes up with this messaging is like, it's not as, I mean, if people have ideas on how to make this flashy and how to make this like really responsive, then we're really interested in that. But I think one of the pieces that we just acknowledge is that like this information is not going to spread as quickly as, for instance, like a Lincoln Project advertisement, which is very intentionally trying to rally people in a certain direction. And so I think that like one of the things that we sort of hold is like these messaging is not oftentimes going to reach as many people in terms of the engagement or in terms of the responses. And I think it's one of the questions is like, what is sexy, flashy peace building look like? And what is sort of the messaging and the imagery that also responds to in this space? And so this is Julie and I sort of testing it out and seeing what it sort of looks like from our lens, and really curious what that looks like from other people's lenses.
Yeah, we do a lot of A/B testing and did in the past as well. And we found, unsurprisingly, that the ones that drive engagement are posts about controversial hot button issues with controversial hot button image, you know, which at times is worth it because it's starting a conversation, but just we're now trying to refine, yeah, how much that's used and for what purpose. Because we don't want to be contributing also to that.
Absolutely. Raymond, do you want to come on screen? You've had a lot of response and I'm just appreciating the background. Oh, got it. Okay, great. Perfect.
Yeah. Cool. Did we miss any questions? Oh, we have one that we did miss. Can some of these strategies be replicated to do the country way? I should read that whole thing. Successful strategies to influence how people think and approach polarization are used and deployed by people that want communities to be polarized. Can some of these strategies be replicated to the contrary? Yeah, so that's really the goal. And Ahi, you've like nailed it, of the Commons Project and how it originated, is we see people using social media to have influence in nefarious ways, sometimes purposely driven towards polarization, sometimes unknowingly driving polarization. And so can we use those same social media affordances and strategies to do the opposite, whether that's using automation, using ads, moving through networks and groups, etc.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Anything else?
Trying to do that for a while, but hitting the unmute button like a crazy person for 15 minutes.
Sorry about that. We meant to
Waiting for it to turn back on. That's okay. No, I mean, I love everything you're doing. Just seeing the research that you've done. I run a software company in the social activism space, and this is a conversation we've been having a lot about lately, is that creating new platforms only moves the problem from one location to another, right? And so how do you create a platform for any purpose of social engagement and not invite either a bubble creation experience where people close their minds and they create this nice little bubble? I see that a lot on Clubhouse, unfortunately. People are being invited in, they're so like-minded, and it's invite only, that you create these very cloistered spaces. And if you're going to fix society, you need to do both, right? You need to go after the large networks and begin to seed, more collegial behavior and listening. And then for these closed networks, you have to educate people on how to moderate, how to lead discussion, so that we don't move the problem from the center stage to the back room, which is what we see happening with a lot of these sites when they mean well in terms of freedom of speech, and we're going to allow you to go here and do whatever you want, but it's what do they want to do? Like, why are they moving over? So I'm very interested in kind of success you're having in taking these gigantic social networks and beginning to redirect the behavior, because it's a huge task. And we've been just struggling with that. Do we create a smaller environment where it's easier to implement some of the things you're talking about and do it, hill by hill?
Right.
And Kate, can I jump in, given what Raymond just said? I put something in the chat that I sort of knew about before Saturday, but only really processed on Saturday. There's a whole world of mediators who now do online dispute resolution. And a lot of it started out doing bots, not the way you guys did, but in other forms. And for Raymond, there's a really interesting guy named Colin Rule, who now is the CEO of Mediate.com, but he had a company before that called Modria that was bought out by somebody else. And it's designed to produce more mediated outcomes rather than the kind of facilitated, depolarizing thing that you were talking about, or that Kate and Julie were talking about. But you should probably look at them, and I can make the contact happen.
Yeah, great. That's awesome. I will definitely take a look at that. Because one of the other side things that we have going on was looking at, do we need to create, moderation bots or tools or training for people in a grassroots social network? Because if not, then they're going to go in there and do what people normally do, which is, create this kind of bubble that leans one way. And sometimes that bubble closes your ears to alternative points of view. So I'm curious, any technique or technology that would allow that to be avoided?
Yeah, so hook me in on this conversation, Chip, when you start it, because I have a lot of connections to community-based mediators who are working on this, and one who's developed a facilitation bot. I'd say it faces a lot of the same challenges that we did at first with automation, and that the human touch is just so important. And the bot can serve functions of reminding of norms or reminding of rules, or maybe asking a good question here and there. But yeah, having that human touch is so important. But this is, tapping into this network. The US actually has like an incredible network of community-based mediators. We have the NCDT, we have the Kettering Foundation, the National Issues Forums, Community Solutions for Action. All of these are like really strong US based and integrated networks that are doing dialogue, mostly offline, but now also online as well. And so we want to be able to tap into these networks and get people to engage. I think one challenge that we've been seeing is that we have all these incredible peace building organization and institutions in the US, and people want to engage from their institution. But what the comments we're trying to shift is we're trying to engage as individuals separate from our institution, so that the Julie Hawk on my social media feed interacting with my Idaho-based, and Michigan-based conservative network is not different than the Julie of Build Up. And we've seen that divide a little bit of people separating their institutional from their individual social media engagement. What if we tap this network of people that know how to do this?
Julie, you're missing perhaps the most important grassroots network, which is the National Federation for Community Mediation, NAFCM.org, that has a couple hundred community mediation centers around the US, maybe in Canada too. And they are increasingly, like everyone else, looking for online ways of doing these things. And I could put you in touch with them. I mean, they're more organically connected to communities than you mentioned NCDD and the others who do great work,
Right.
the Bridge Alliance and the like. But these are really people anchored in the ground. I'm also involved with this US Truth and Racial Healing and Transformation movement that's also trying to figure out how you do stuff online. And the idiot in me hasn't figured out to connect you guys to all of them yet, but I'll do that next or this afternoon.
Yeah, that would be great. And the other, you just reminded me, Chip, is that while we want to be connected to all these peace builders and mediators, we also want in order to sustain the movement, we need it to go beyond peace building. Raymond, we need you and your software developers.
Yep.
We see this in really interesting ways right now with the anti-racism advocates, is that, a very small portion of people in there, I think, would call themselves peace builders. And the same in the depolarization space too. So it's how do we get at all of these different people and not turn them off because of language barriers, et cetera, for using jargon and all that. I know we're just about out of time. Kate, does anyone else have anything to add? Kate and I can put our emails. And so if you want to continue the conversation or connect us with people you think we should be connected to, that would be really great. And otherwise, thank you for joining.
Cool.
Yeah, I'll follow up an email.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. We'll look forward to keeping you updated.
Cool. Thank you. Bye.
I
Bye.